Hi guys! This is your first set of video notes for the entire AP Psychology course. Hopefully they'll be very easy for you to follow. When we covered pre-scientific psychology, the big key issue that was discussed at that point in time, before we had the ability to do brain scans, for example, or any of that kind of modern technology use, the big question was, is there a relationship between the mind and the body? Does our brain affect how we act and behave and operate, or are they separate and distinct? So if you go based on the argument that the mind and the body are connected, that goes toward Hebrew teaching, all the way to Aristotle with the ancient Greeks, even up into Augustine, who was very influential within spreading Christian teachings. The other argument to all of this is that the mind and body are distinct. So guys like Socrates, Plato, through ancient Greece argued that they are two separate things. They don't necessarily influence one another. You act one way, you think another way. Another individual who argued this point was a guy named René Descartes. He's French. He came around during the time of the Enlightenment, late 1600s, early 1700s. The other big component to pre-scientific psych is how are ideas formed? How do we develop a thought process? And how do we end up acting upon it? Are some ideas naturally within us when we are born? And that argument fell with what Socrates and Plato argued, that we are driven by instinct essentially. And so as such, that's why we act and think the way that we do. The other argument is that when you're born, you are actually a blank slate. You are not driven by instinct. You don't have instinct. Any behavior that you act on, whether it's to get food, to drink, to speak, it's all learned behavior. We go through it based on experience. And so as such, we are a blank slate. They referred to it, John Locke coined a Latin term called the tabula rasa. And so this is what he argued is how our ideas are formed. It's through experience. We move into the greater study of science as kind of a systematic approach to looking at behavior and thought process. So the first to do this is going to be a guy named Vilhelm Mundt. He's considered to be the father of psychology, mostly because of the fact that he established the first laboratory to study the mental processes that we go through and the behavior that we act on. He sets this up in Germany, so he's not American. Wundt's goal was to study the conscious aspect of our behavior. He wants to know how the elements of your mind, or the structure of it, is organized and how that relates to the impact that brain structures can have on one another and on your behavior. So he's the father of structuralism. What he's going to use is something called introspection. Basically what he does is he journals. He writes down every thought, feeling, emotion, behavior that he has during a day, and he tries to understand why he felt that way, why he thought that way, why he behaved that way. The problem with introspection, and why we don't use it any longer, is that it's not scientifically based. It can lead to some level of bias, because oftentimes when we try to go back and we look at and explain our own behaviors, we tend to kind of push them off to the wayside, or we try to explain them off in a positive light. We refer to that as the self-serving bias. So we're not terribly unbiased toward our behavior. We can't scientifically look at it. Functionalism, on the other hand, will be an American contribution. This is done by William James. James establishes functionalism as an argument against Wundt's structuralism. He says the structure doesn't matter with regard to your brain and your functioning. And in fact, Wundt's arguments are really narrow and kind of boring. He didn't really like what Wundt had to say. He was really heavily influenced by Darwin and this argument of survival of the fittest and evolution. So what he wants to take a look at is your consciousness, much like Wundt did. But what he wants to see is what are the functions of the thought processes and the behaviors that they had, and how did they seem to contribute to our survival as a species and our evolution to our environment. So he's very heavily influenced by that thought process. He does use introspection like Wundt did to try to get at the heart of why we behave the way that we do. But he does attempt to move psychology toward a more scientific approach by using uniform questionnaires. So he would ask the exact same questions with regard to behaviors. He would fill out mental tests. And since that is a much more standardized approach and uniform, it leads to more scientific findings. They're not entirely unbiased, but they move us along accordingly. And then we have Gestalt psychology. This is established by a guy named Max Vertheimer. Again, he's a German. He is going to establish his argument in reaction to both Mundt and his ideas. So his argument, Vertheimer, is essentially that our understanding of the world around us and the behavior that we act upon accordingly deals with our understanding of the whole of our experience. So his argument is essentially the whole is, greater than the sum of the parts that create it. This is kind of difficult for kids to catch on to. We do go further into it in the sensation and perception unit, but the basic gist that you need to understand about Gestalt psychology is that we understand best when we look at the entire experience that a person goes through, instead of just trying to break it down and understanding it into smaller portions of this is why they acted that way, and this is why they thought that way, and this is why they behaved this way. So instead of kind of micromanaging a person's study of behavior, Vertheimer is going to try to look at the whole of things. Alright, so then we move into more modern studies of psychology. So when we say modern, that means that we get to about the 1900s and from then on up until now. So this is where we get to Freud. Freud's a very interesting guy. Freud is the individual who is very much influenced by the study of the unconscious mind and how that influences our behavior. He argues that abnormal behavior that people express, so mental disorders, for example, or something that's considered to be just outside of the norm and kind of weird, it's driven by an unconscious part of your brain that you have no awareness of. And the way to kind of tap into what's going on in your unconscious is through something called free association and dream analysis. So your dreams are a gateway into your unconscious, and so it's very important to take a look at the symbolic meaning of what the dream imagery means. He also looks at free association. This is where a therapist will sit down with their patient and they will just throw various different words or phrases at the patient. And the goal is for the patient to not censor their thoughts in any manner. So that way you can tap into that unreserved inner consciousness that you have that you're not aware of. Oftentimes this is a way to very easily get into problems that a person might have. For example, teenagers tend to have very negative responses to the word mother, father, family, or school. So there's a way to be able to tap into that unconscious and be able to pull that out of something. His ideas were very controversial at the time that they came out. They will be right after World War I ends, right around 1918. And they still are, because a lot of kids just don't understand how it's possible for much of what Freud argued to be factually accurate. And scientifically speaking, you can't measure it. And so his ideas are going to be very controversial, but in the end, his contributions to the study of psychology are so influential that we do discuss him quite a bit. And then we move to behaviorism. Behaviorism is going to become very popular for about a 40-year period in between the 1920s and 1960s. But I will say that it is still very popular today because it is based entirely on what is observable and scientifically measurable. Okay, so this disagrees entirely with the argument that you have an unconscious mind. Guys like B.F. Skinner and J.B. Watson that you can see here, they didn't agree with Freud in any manner. They thought that his arguments were very, very funny and kind of weird. And so they don't necessarily follow with his arguments. They kind of break away from that entirely. So Watson, up at the top, argued that you should only study what is capable of being measured objectively. So, with that then, you cannot take a look at an unconscious mind. You can only look at what a person acts upon or thinks in a manner that is easily measurable. B.F. Skinner, on the other hand, he argues that external factors are what shape behavior, so there's no unconscious mind. And he argues that you are shaped based on reinforcement or punishment. So you will continue behavior that is rewarded, and you'll cut off behavior and stop it if it's punished. And we'll move further into these guys a little bit later. So, as I said earlier, contemporary psychology's big issue is going to be how do we explain scientifically what behavior and mental process means. And the overall argument is it going to be nature, okay, our genetics, the biological makeup that we have, or is it nurture, the environment that we're raised in, or the experiences that we have through our life? And that's going to be the big key issue that we have to confront on a virtually daily basis through the study of psychology. And the overall argument amongst psychologists is that it is both. They both contribute in some manner, and that it's not necessarily going to be one or the other. So, some topics that I'd like you to think about. What's the greatest cause of psychological disorders such as depression, multiple personalities, schizophrenia? Is it nature, genetic components to things? Or is it nurture, experiences that a person has, or the environment that they're raised in? Same for sexual orientation. Is it genetically predisposed, or is it done because of experience or an environment that a person is raised in? Same with intelligence, and also with becoming a serial killer. Are you hardwired when you're born to become a serial killer, or is it through your experiences in life that you become one? So now we move on to the contemporary approaches, and the basic combination of factors that most psychologists will agree with is something called the biopsychosocial approach. So in this scenario, it means that biological factors, psychological factors, and sociocultural factors, experiences and environment, all interact with one another to create the behavior that we see on a daily basis and the thought processes that people go through. And so that's the basic argument. So this very much encompasses contemporary psych's argument that behavior and thought processes are combined because of nature and nurture. So, much of what our current perspectives involve are going to fall under the categories of biological psych, psychological influences, or social psych, so social influence of things. Neuroscience, evolutionary perspectives, and behavioral genetic perspectives. All three of these fall within biological parameters because they're very high emphases on physical structure, physical makeup, and genes, as well as the evolutionary process and how behaviors ended up developing accordingly. In addition to that, you have the psychodynamic perspective. They're going to kind of pull out of psychoanalysis, out of Freud's argument, and so this is where you're going to see individuals like Carl Jung, and so what they're going to emphasize is the unconscious mind, much like Freud, but they're going to do so in a more positive manner, and we'll move further into them when we cover personality. You also have behavioralism, so this is again where we cover J.B. Watson, B.F. Skinner. How do we learn the behavior that we do? Why do we act on it? Why do we see another person behave in a way and then we mimic it in kind? That's what they really want to get a look at. You also have the cognitive perspective. This looks at how thought processes themselves end up influencing why you act the way that you do. Your perception of how a person behaves really does influence the behavior that you'll act upon. And we'll move into that further too. Humanism argues that we're all capable of personal growth and able to achieve whatever it is that we want to achieve, and so as such we're all very different from one another. And they really emphasize something called the self-concept. How you see yourself matters when it comes to the behavior that you act on and the thought processes that you have. If you have very low self-confidence, obviously you're going to behave in a manner that exhibits that. So that's the cognitive perspective, or excuse me, the humanist perspective. And then we have the sociocultural. This is where we argue that an environment that you're raised in and cultural norms heavily influence a person's behavior. So when you're here in school, the cultural norm is that you're quiet, you sit in your desk, and then you pay attention. When you guys are outside of school, you're loud, and you're very, very different in terms of your personality. So how is it that an environment influences your behavior? That's what sociocultural perspectives try to get a look at. So when we move into discussing these perspectives in class, you're going to do an activity for me where you discuss an outrageous celebrity and how the various different approaches would explain their behavior. So I want you to be thinking about a particular person that you know that's fairly famous, that's kind of been a little out there, and we'll be working on kind of diagnosing them when we get into class.